Greetings, friends. You are on the Military Reports channel. And today we will discuss with you the situation in Ukraine on the 11th of April, 2024 year. A lot of things have happened today, so let's get started. Of course, the most important event is a missile strike, and not even just a missile strike. And there were also drones being beaten with geraniums, which were inflicted last night and this morning. As a result of this strike, a large number of energy infrastructure facilities were damaged, warehouses were destroyed, let's say. Air defense was suppressed, and so on. Here, approximately on these frames in front of your eyes, you can see the routes of how the blows were struck today. See, there are 4 colors here. Let's say turquoise is so blue. These are geranium flights, which today, as you can see, were struck in the Odessa region. Along the Dnieper in Kiev, and including individual geraniums flew to western Ukraine, most likely in order to identify air defense systems. Then we see the red lines. These are, let's say, cruise missiles, which, as we see, changed their trajectories during the flight. Tried to turn somehow, possibly change their trajectories so as not to get hit by the Ukrainian air defense, which is most likely already missing. There is also a yellow color here. It's ballistics, it's hard to say, most likely these are daggers. And there is a very interesting picture of the southernmost direction. In the area of Zaporozhye, there are 3 gray arrows, including most likely more daggers, which only took off from the south direction. As a result of the strikes, a large number of objects were destroyed and damaged. In western Ukraine, it is reported that a large number of strikes were carried out in the area of the settlement of Stry. One of the largest gas storage facilities used by the European Union is located here. In particular, it is reported about a hit and a blow to the Burstin power plant. There were no shots confirming the damage or that they got here at all. And then, literally from the very morning, footage began to arrive from the area of the settlement of Ukrainka, and about the Tripoli power plant. Here are the first shots that have arrived. In other words, some sources report that up to 3 daggers were launched at this power plant, and we understand with you that this power plant has obviously been destroyed. That is, there is no chance of its recovery. That is, at this time, it is most likely necessary to build a power plant almost from scratch. Well, maybe there are 50%, 60%, but in general, in any case, in the near future, in the next year, at least during the special military operation of the Ukrainian leadership, there is no possibility of restoring this power plant. Perhaps in peacetime, it makes sense, and it is possible to restore it, but during the period of hostilities, it is absolutely impossible, and even more so given the fact that at the moment the power plant is the #1 goal for Russia. Here are some more of the same shots. This is the same station from a different angle. We see with you that the damage was certainly significant. So in general, the situation is developing in the saddest way for Ukraine. The explosions took place not only and, let's say, in these areas of the power plant, all over Ukraine, Odessa, Kharkiv, and so on. Ukrainians reported on the work of the air defense. They report that they managed to shoot down 18 of the 42 missiles and 39 of the 40 geraniums, that is, almost all of them. That is, we see with you that even now they are already showing the most not the best indicators, statistics on the work of air defense. And well, perhaps this is most likely due to the fact that it becomes very difficult to hide the results of strikes. And perhaps if it were possible to hide the results of strikes, if strikes were inflicted on military facilities, perhaps the Ukrainians showed that they shot down everything. But since the strikes were inflicted on objects in the first place, even possibly by civil infrastructure, then of course it is impossible to hide such strikes, to hide, say, a fire at the same Tripoli power plant. But, for example, the strikes on Odessa were published on the same frames that we considered with you. Here, for example, are the blows, most likely, that were inflicted on Odessa. Sources report that in these frames we can observe the AFU air defense system in the area of the city in the Odessa region, in the area of the city of Chernomorsk. However, as a result of a missile strike, This VA system was completely destroyed, most likely along with the radar. In other words, there is suppression. By the way, pay attention, we have not heard anything about Patriots for a long time, and in recent weeks, as a whole. It has been destroyed exclusively with the 300 system. That is, most likely there are no Patriots at all anymore. And of course, if we talk about Kharkiv, then let's say Galii calls it the Kharkiv region. Reported today that the strike was carried out by missiles, and Kharkiv was carried here today with the use of S-300 missiles. At the same time, a lot of interesting information is being received from you in Kharkiv. Here they continue to publish shots of blows with FABs on the border. But it's strange here, of course, the situation is developing. Please note that people are even discussing this story, that while the Ukrainian side has not tried to land troops, say in the village of Kazenko, they have not tried to attack Belgorod. In general, there was more or less a peaceful, quiet life in Kharkiv. Of course there were arrivals, there were strikes, but in general it was possible to live. But after that operation at the border, we see how the fighting intensified. The Russian side constantly strikes. And in general, it is now obvious and understandable that because of the operation that was carried out by the APU in the border area, with the use of pro-Ukrainian proxies, now those operations have become the reason, and, in fact, the basis for conducting some kind of sanitary operation. To create a sanitary zone, which, perhaps if the operation develops successfully, can even develop into a full-scale Kharkiv offensive operation, with the result in order to establish full control over the capital of the region. But at the same time, of course, it all looks suspicious and strange. And among other things, it is worth noting that there were a large number of explosions in Kharkiv. Here it is published by citizens, peaceful citizens. Here are the results of the strikes: a large amount of smoke, a large number of objects including were damaged. And we, on the basis of all these news, on the basis of all these strikes, on the basis of all these rumors, Ukrainians began to spread the news about the beginning of a mass forced evacuation from 47 settlements, and the main blow. The main emphasis is on the evacuation of the Kharkiv region, or rather, to be more precise, the settlement of Bogodukov. Then Kharkiv, the Kharkiv and Raisins. That is, here is Bogodukov, Kharkiv. This region is coming, it is subject to evacuation. Raisins are subject to evacuation. It is very difficult to understand the logic of why the Ukrainians decided to evacuate these special points. It's hard to guess, but it's very much here. How to say, it is not worth thinking, and it is not worth evaluating that Ukrainian operation on the borderline, when they tried to cross, as some kind of attempt to possibly get a media victory, or something like that. It is always worth thinking. And thinking about whether it was done on purpose to force the Russian command, the Russian leadership to attack first of all. It is to Kharkiv. Not somewhere on Chernihiv, on Suma, on Kiev, or on Odessa, or on Zaporozhye, or Dnipro-Dnipropetrovsk, namely on Kharkov. We cannot make hasty conclusions, but our whole history will show us this is the end of this battle, which will begin and end sooner or later. Then we will only be able to answer whether it was all done on purpose or it really was a big mistake of the high. When they started Operation Borderland, and at the same time, additional and more personnel are coming in to conduct reconnaissance, combat reconnaissance. Let's say a new type of reconnaissance using drones and padrons. And along the border, the VSO patrols the territory, flying several kilometers deep into Russian territory, trying to identify positions, trying to identify where the concentration of forces is taking place. And these shots are published almost every day. That is, we can assume and conclude that a really critical mass is gradually gaining its power here, strength in the Kharkiv direction. And most likely, we can already say with a probability of 70%, the Kharkiv operation is inevitable. Maybe something will change at the last moment, but it seems to be inevitable. At the same time, some sources report that it was in the Kapinski direction. That additional and a large number of field hospitals were deployed in order to receive a large number of wounded, well, that is, promptly to process all this. And including, of course, such hospitals will not be deployed 3 months before the offensive, that is, they will be deployed in not 2 weeks, perhaps a maximum. Yes, there is something to bring there, some blood, supplies, medicines. And start waiting for what is inevitable here happen. Well, we will observe what will happen in Kharkiv, although sources report that the population itself does not leave Kharkiv. Well, it's hard to understand. Perhaps the Ukrainians made the decision of the command to use dimensional residents, local residents of Kharkiv, for at least several purposes. The first is a human shield, and the second is an ideal militia, in which case anyone can be armed even with a simple machine gun. And 1,300,000 people with machine guns will be very difficult to storm. And despite the fact that most of them may be holding this machine for the first time. That is, well, there are their own tactics, their own plans. We will watch how it all ends. Then we go with you to the South Kupiansk direction. Let me remind you here that over the past few days, the AFU has conducted small counterattacks, small counteroffensive operations, in order to regain control over the lost territories. Today, the APU decided to continue. Footage of artillery strikes on, let's say, separate positions, a separate forest belt of the Russian army, will be published. In other words, this has never happened before. And there is an extremely high probability that the armed forces of Ukraine will try to attack again in the coming weeks. Checking the defense of the Russian Federation, whether the Russian army is able to repel attacks. After the losses that the Russian army suffered here during attempts to reach the settlement of Terny. We'll be watching. Then we move with you to the Belagorsky direction. The armed forces of the Russian Federation continues to clean up the chalk dump itself. So far, no information has been received about further progress, and footage of artillery strikes on the AFU positions in the city itself is being published, but again, without any operations there. Let's say, on the southern outskirts of the dump, again, footage of drone strikes is published, that is, a sweep is still underway. Here, apparently, the APU has dug up quite a lot, now it all has to be cleaned up. And of course the most interesting thing is the battles that were deployed for this stronghold. You see, we've mapped it. Fierce fighting has been carried out here for the last few days and various. We discussed the video on this site yesterday, and now pro-Russian sources are painting over this area completely, including some neutral sources, including painting this area under the color of the Russian army. We are not in a hurry to do this yet. After all, the support is large enough, it takes a lot of time to clean it up, a lot of time to spend it all. Here for sure, the APU has repeatedly counterattacked, so I think it's worth waiting, but in any case, I repeat, if they have already caught on, then most likely the APU will roll back to Verkhnikomayanskaya in the near future. And then the Russian army entering the most populated area will begin advancing westward towards Seversk. Where and along which in particular, over the past day. Various weapons, bombs, missiles, artillery have repeatedly arrived. Well, that is, Seversk in any case, regardless of whether there will be a Kharkiv operation, there will not be a Kharkiv operation. Seversk was, Seversky operation will be. And in the southern direction, including the Russian army continues, let's say, to clear the forest belts and the railway along the Na. Along the Belagorskovka line, let's say, there is an excavation, artillery preparation is underway, strikes are being carried out, and attempts are being made to disrupt rotation. So far, no active actions have been taken on Earth. There is a similar situation with regard to Razdulovka. Here we continue to carry out rotations, bring up fresh forces, in anticipation of when the offensive will begin. Well, naturally at this moment, the Russian army catches, let's say, the APU fighters on rotation, and throws grenades at the AF. As a result of which the APU, of course, suffer losses. But in general, there is also no active phase on Earth. There is a similar story about the Watch. There was no active phase on Earth today, or at least, there was no news about it. There was, let's say, a counter-battery duel, artillery strikes were carried out, Lumors flew in, Ukrainian positions were brought in. In other words, let's say, in my opinion, this is even the second day when the Russian army does not undertake active hostilities. APU, by the way, began to actively use J-ladies, for example, during a special military operation. This is the second frame in 2 days of the use of this type of weapon. Yesterday in Krasnogorsk, a similar story flew to the southeastern part of the control of the Russian army, today already in Ivanovo. But in general, as you can see, there is a front line here, at least there was no news about the change. In turn, the Russian army continues its assault operations west of Ivanovskaya, trying to reach the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. A blow is being struck if, and in general, everything is quite difficult for the APU to develop here. Then we go with you to the Avdiivka direction, firm where a large amount of interesting information comes, which is worth paying attention to. The Russian army actually changed its focus after, let's say, having already approached the final stage of the battle for Yasnobrodov-Kanilovy-Umanskaya. Here, in fact, history has already been completed. This is obvious to everyone. So by the time we came to 95% of the completion of the operation, that is, by the time Ukraine is no longer able to change anything, and all it can do is throw this line, let's say, with light prey there, which is destroyed with the use of artillery, drones. In other words, it is now more reasonable to retreat from here and let the Russian troops occupy this bridgehead. But for some reason you still continued to hold on. And as soon as the whole story has already come to this stage, the armed forces of the Russian Federation have become as active as possible, along the lines of the Novokalinov, Karamik, Arkhangelskaya, and Kalinova queues. In other words, it is obvious that there really will be an offensive operation on Osheratina in the near future. And this is the last height at this turn. Right now, a counter-battery struggle is underway. With the use of Krasnopol, Ukrainian artillery, Ukrainian long-range crabs are suppressed. There are these 777th. All this is being conducted quite successfully so far. In the Kalinov area, again, another howitzer was destroyed, but now we see here a full-fledged counter-battery struggle. Suppression of artillery, and information is being received about the further advancement of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Already in the locality of Novokalinov itself, sources report that during the fighting, during a rather decisive, I would even say so, assault, lightning fast to some extent, the armed forces of the Russian Federation managed to enter the locality itself and establish control over this street. I think it's central or whatever it's called, right? That is, we are not painting over the map yet, because we do not have reliable video confirmations. But if this information is confirmed, then it is of course a great sadness for the armed forces of Ukraine. To lose a new Kalina, in fact, without a fight. Fortified area, you see what a network of developed fortifications here, so to lose this area faster than they lost Orlovka, where the most intense fighting is being carried out, they simply did not expect it here. If someone just overslept the blow, objectively speaking, the offensive is developing so rapidly that it can be concluded that someone just overslept the offensive from the outside. And if you manage to get in, take the whole street, that's all. But this is already the edge, and definitely the APU will be forced to retreat. And in the case of the lost Kalina ceramics, here the Russian army enters the operational space. And from here, it is already possible to dictate its conditions down to the smallest and smallest details. According to the verdicts of Semenovka, the Russian army is in no hurry. Settlements are still under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. There is an exchange of drone strikes. So far without an active operation on the ground. A similar situation is in Semenovka, Yasnobrodov, Kinilovka, Pervomaiskaya. It is reported that Russian troops entered Umanskaya, but geolocation was not provided. The APU today published a series of drone strikes on the central part of Pervomaisk, which in turn, among other things, confirms once again the control of the Russian army over the entire settlement. However, I repeat, and I told you about it yesterday, that so far, the Ministry of Defense has not reported on the complete capture of Pervomaisky. That is, there is probably some block, some unfortunate house, or some fortification within the city, which is still under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. Then we are moving with you to the Charles Reservoir. Here, among other things, the counter-battery struggle with the use of Krasnopol continues. You are slowly pulling back your artillery to, let's say, the western part of the Charles Reservoir. Another Savushka was identified and destroyed with the use of Krasnopol somewhere in the area of the Charles Reservoir. And of the most important news is, of course, the repeated destruction of the dam, I did not add a video. We will add, unfortunately, we will not look, but there should have been a video. An artillery strike, an air bomb attack, as a result of which the dam in the Charles Reservoir was destroyed. And in general it turns out it was. It has been destroyed many times already. A few months ago, it was also shelled, but even now it turns out that they have lost the opportunity to supply the grouping. In the village of Karlovka, and not Tailova, say, from the village of Seladov. Now it is necessary to make some small detour. Perhaps it didn't have a drastic effect on logistics there, but on the whole it's kind of unpleasant. Then Krasnogorovka. Artillery strikes continue. In the surf, 100% have gained a foothold in the southeastern part. In Yusova, no matter how many counteroffensive attempts were made, all of them were not crowned with success, and the Russian army moved to the fact that it turns out to do what best. Complete artillery, aviation, aerial bomb superiority, mopping up neighborhoods, entire blocks, after which assault actions, and knocking out the AFU fighters to more, let's say, advantageous positions. At the moment, the advance has stopped slightly here, but we should expect a resumption of hostilities in the near future. It would seem that the battle has already ended a long time ago, but for some reason, as they say. For some reason they are pulling the cat for one place, but perhaps there is some kind of meaning to it, some kind of plan. Perhaps to this moment, the APU thinks that it makes sense to cling to the western outskirts, but in general, it probably makes sense. Because it is better to lose personnel on the western outskirts of Novomikhailovka than to lose the same personnel on the eastern outskirts of Konstantinovka. In fact, by changing the terms, the personnel will be lost both there and there, but on the other hand, from the point of view, it is important where it is lost, so perhaps this decision has been made from this side. The Russian army continues to sweep in Pedro 4 strikes, but without an active phase on the ground, including effective counter-battery fighting. There is no news on Ugledar 4 today. And very interesting news began to arrive at us south of the Harvest. The armed forces of the Russian Federation. We have been discussing this area for the third day in a row. There were offensives for taking control of the forest belt, then the AFU counteroffensive, and today another footage was published. Further development of the offensive, or rather attempts by the AF to further expand the bridgehead south of the Harvest. We see strikes from the AFU artillery on moving equipment, personnel. In general, here tanks are already calmly disembarking troops, they are approaching, turning around. Strikes are being carried out in general. That is, based on this video, we colored the map, changed the configuration. The Russian army is currently completely controlled by the southern forest belt, and controlled by this small concrete brick building. Right here, yes. In other words, this is already something, this is already a broad front. Let's even say to some extent. The distance, let's say, the length of the control, which is now observed, is in the region of 2 kilometers. Of these 2 kilometers, it is very, very effective to attack farms located in the southern part. And there will probably be additional personnel for the further advance of the Russian army in the near future, so we see that in fact, Vyazuzhin is not able to stop anything. There are no changes in the work direction. There are, let's say, sluggish military operations, drone strikes, but there are no changes in fact on the ground. In general, let's discuss some small political news. What else have we received today for the day? A lot of information from Kiev. Let's go around it again. Let's say, again, the energy center informs the Ukrainian that during the missile strikes, they lost 100% of electricity generation. In other words, in general, the situation is as critical as possible. In particular, information is being received today that the Americans cannot provide gratuitous assistance to Ukraine. So they decided to sell. American generals, former leaders there, NATO, European and others have a lot of ranks, many positions. Reports that in the near future, the ratio of artillery shells in Russia to Ukraine will be 10-1. And in general, as if this is the moment, that critical moment, that red line to return. If you cross it, then it will be extremely, extremely, extremely difficult to restore some kind of parity back. Kiev is becoming more and more aggressive in its demands to Western countries. Let's say Foreign Minister Kuleba said today that the most important task of the whole world is to provide assistance to Ukraine. And if someone asks for help from Western countries trying to stand up to Ukraine, then this state is automatically considered hostile to Ukraine. Well, this is an interesting logic, that is, only we are no one else. Well, in general, as if it is clear, it can be understood unambiguously. Zelensky, at the same time, continues to promote the topic of a peaceful, let's say, settlement, his peace plan. And there will soon be a meeting of Switzerland without, let's say, Russian representatives, where the peace settlement plan will be finally discussed, after which this plan will be brought to the attention of the Russian leadership. Although it is difficult to understand, it is difficult to imagine how they will be able to persuade the Russian leadership to such a plan. Perhaps there are some underwater moments that no one knows. And today it is interesting to note that Alexander Grigoryevich Lukashenko has arrived in Moscow on a working visit. Will meet with Putin today, will certainly solve some important issues. Perhaps they will exchange some important and intelligence information, including. And finally, today we again received a specific threat from the President of Ukraine, Zelensky, that a plan is being developed for the third destruction of the third attempt to destroy the Crimean Bridge. Here is such an interesting idea after all, there is such an idea. But again, let's summarize a bit. The most important thing is that here is the evacuation from Kharkov, but I ask you to treat this information with a degree of skepticism. And the thing is that today, among other things, these strikes, the destruction of energy infrastructure, today, among other things. Another very important event took place. Ukraine has adopted a law on mobilization. This is a terrible law. This is a monstrous law, a law that will surely destroy the lives and destinies of many people, including break them.